Survival. Prior to its establishment, the land that is now Spotsylvania County originally formed the extreme western ends of Essex, King and Queen, and King William counties. In 1720, the county of Spotsylvania would be established by an act of the House of Burgess.
When Spotsylvania County was developed in 1720, out of 3 existing counties, slavery was already in full swing.
For 14 years, Spotsylvania County included the lands that now compose Orange, Culpeper, Madison, Rappahannock, and Greene counties, and originally extended west across the Blue Ridge Mountains into the Shenandoah Valley. In 1734, Orange County was created, and Spotsylvania County attained its current size and shape. For much of the colonial period, residents of Virginia were governed by 2 local entities, the county and the parish. County government set up courts and enforced the law and settled disputes. In 1722, the first county seat was established in Germanna and became the residence of the Lieutenant Governor, Spotswood. The site would serve at this location of the county court until 1732, when Spotsylvania County Court would be moved from Germanna to Fredericksburg, which was emerging as a major regional commercial center and formally incorporated in 1782, and was moved to its present site in 1839. After discovering iron ore in the vicinity of the Rapidan River, Spotswood purchased tens of thousands of acres while governor from 1713 to 1722 to stake his claim to the potential iron ore producing lands. In 1727, the General Assembly would encourage the establishment of ironworks in Virginia by exempting ironworks from the county and parish levies for 5 years and from working on and maintaining roads. As a result, Spotswood Massaponax Air Furnace, the Fredericksville Furnace and Mines, known as Douglas Run, Charles Chiswell's Furnace and Mines, and the Accokeek Furnace and Mines would be established. According to Bird's Westover manuscripts, Spotswood described his operations as running almost completely on enslaved labor. Quote, "I will deliver up 60 able working slaves with 12 to 15 of their children. The increase of the children after the commencement of the lease born of the women slaves delivered up shall be to the benefit of the leasee. I hire no woodcutters, colliers, mine raisers, mine burners, mine washers, fellow furnace keepers, cartiers, pipe borers, wheelwrights, or smiths. A founder and general overseer, the whole business of my ironwork is carried on by slaves, who have no wages and will always be more subservient and observant of orders than freemen in this country will be." End quote. Charles Chiswell, manager of the Fredericksville Mine and Furnace, is quoted by William Byrd as believing that, quote, 120 slaves, including women, were necessary to carry on all the business of an ironwork, and the more Virginians amongst them, the better. Though in that number he comprehended cartiers, colliers, and that those that planted the corn. End of quote. It was this sacrificial labor of the enslaved that brought about the successful development of the early iron industry in Virginia. Formal census of the population of Virginia was undertaken until the 1780s. However, county and St. George's Parish tax records provide insight into the county's population growth over the next 40-year period, and based upon those records of taxable persons. In 18th century Virginia, it included all males over the age of 16, enslaved and indentured servants over the age of 16. White women and white children were not taxed. British historian Philip Morgan has argued that the increase in proportion of mulattoes to blacks in colonial times allow argument for the prevalence of interracial relations. Although white men and black women were rarely punished for these encounters, black men and white women were.
Let me start off first by saying that, yes, I'm African American. I know my skin color is a little light, but back in the 18th and 19th century, there were a lot of people that had my skin color. You see, slavery was based on what your mother was. So if your mother's enslaved, you're enslaved. If your mother's free, you're free. It had nothing to do with what your father was. Now, why do you think that was? Well, you know, there was a lot of slave owners who did take advantage of their African American female slaves. And so their children would have then been enslaved. Didn't matter that the father was free.
The 1662 law establishing the rule of
partes sequitur ventrum.
In the 1860 census, it showed that the South had approximately 4.5 million enslaved African Americans. In the state of Virginia, they held more persons in bondage than any other state in the Union. That's why the state of Virginia was selling slaves into the Deep South.
this relatively inexpensive output required of planters encouraged the expansion of existing quarters and the establishment of new ones. The result was a fairly rapid distribution of enslaved.
So what does it mean to be a slave? Let's look at that a little bit. You know, slavery is really based on the region that you were enslaved. So if you were here in the state of Virginia, you were considered in the Upper South. If you were a slave in places like South Carolina or Georgia, you were considered the Lower South. So slavery was really dictated by the type of crop that you were forced to grow, because most of British North America and then the United States was an agrarian society, meaning that they raised crops to sustain their life. So the enslaved community was forced to work from sunup to sundown, or can to can't. Can work because the sun's come up, can't work because the sun's gone down. And I don't know about you, I'm a native Virginian, but in the summer the sun comes up at 5:30 and usually goes down around 8:30 or 9. So just think about it. You would be up at the sunrise and you wouldn't go back to your cabin until the sun set. And you would do that 6 days a week. Yes, slaves worked 6 days a week, and they only had one day off, and that day was Saturday.
According to records of the Library of Congress, slave marriages had neither legal standing nor protection from the abuse and restrictions imposed upon them by slave owners. Enslaved husbands and wives, without legal recourse, could be separated or sold at their master's will. Couples who resided on different plantations were allowed to visit only with the consent of their owners. However, some were graced with a formal ceremony. Benjamin, who was brought to Tennessee from Virginia as a young boy, described such an event in a pension application he filled as the dependent of his deceased son, John. "We were married on the farm. The Reverend Ben White, a black preacher, said the marriage ceremony. The wedding ceremony," he continued, "took place on the porch of the owner. It was with this knowledge and consent of my master and Sarah's master that we were married." Formal marriage ceremonies for the enslaved couples like Benjamin and Sarah were generally reserved for house servants. The ceremony could include the slave marriage ritual of jumping the broom, which required slave couples to jump over a broomstick. The custom of jumping the broom could vary from plantation to plantation.
So what were they doing when they were working for the master? Well, basically you can look at it that they were giving away their labor for free, forcibly giving their labor away for free, because remember, they were property. Just like you own your house or your car, or your children own their bicycles, you would then own people. You could, if you owned slaves, you could sell them, you could give them away in your will as inheritance, or you could let them go, but very few did that. But you were their property. And so you worked for them in the field, and in the beginning of slavery, in the early 1620s, on up and through the Civil War, the end of the Civil War, Virginia in the beginning was a tobacco growing colony. That tobacco was the cash crop for Virginia. And so your responsibility was to work in the fields. And you'd work in those fields in the hot sun, as I said, sun up to sundown, 6 days a week. Even if you were a child, if you were old enough to be able to pick a worm off of a tobacco leaf, that's what you would do. Even at the age of 6 or 7, you would go pick worms or tobacco worms or hornworms off the back of tobacco leaves. Well, why would you have to do that? Well, let's think about it. If the worm eats all the tobacco, the man that owns you has nothing that he can then send to England to make money. And your role in all of this, in this economy, is to make sure that that cash crop of tobacco is well enough and tended to go and be shipped to England, so whoever owns you can make money and live in the lifestyle that they have become accustomed to. So life was very hard. Life was very hard as being an enslaved person, even if you worked near the big house. And there's a lot of instances where people think that, well, if you worked in the big house, you didn't have to work very hard, or you got better food, or you got better clothing. Well, in reality, let's think about this. If you worked in the big house, you were going to be around whoever owned you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You did not have the opportunity to go back to your cabin and be with your family some way. No, you were in the big house making sure that whoever owned you had their tea, or had their food, or had their whatever it is that they needed, their chamber pots empty. That was your task. And they saw what you were doing 24/7. There was no sense of community or identity when you're around whoever owns you all the time. And you were still given the same rations. Slaves per week were given a ration, whether you worked in the big house or you worked in the fields. You had the same ration. And that ration was 4 cups of cornmeal and fatback, about 1 pound to 3 pounds of fatback. Well, fatback is just what it says, it's fat back. It's the fat back of the hog, and that's what you got. Maybe in the summer, some milk if they had dairy cows, maybe 3 to 4 salted herrings, but that's it. You don't get anything else. So think about surviving off of that meager ration and then having to go out in the fields all day long in the sun, or having to go to the laundry and do the laundry, or having to go to the kitchen and do all the cooking for whoever owns you. That's a long day.
Many members within the enslaved community would pass on extraordinary mental, physical, and survival skills necessary to exist and simultaneously sustain the two growing cultures. Although at great risk, many resisted violence and enslavement in subtle and effective ways, frequently establishing their own pace of work regardless of the instructions of an overseer. In a rural quarter, the enslaved significantly outnumbered their white overseer, and it provided numerous opportunities for individual acts of independence and cleverness.
Spotsylvania, being a very agricultural county like most other counties outside of Williamsburg, they had to grow a lot of food because that was about all you could do to make money aside from growing tobacco, because the soil was so poor here. cotton would really take it out. So they tried cotton, but cotton didn't grow well. So either way, with tobacco or cotton, you have to have a lot of labor, and that's where slavery comes in. It was the crux of making this country grow.
Tobacco was a dominant export in Virginia, with tobacco notes serving as legal tender to settle debts and pay taxes. White landowners of a certain class who aspired to enter the social economic elite became planters, with tobacco production the driving force of early settlement and the development of Spotsylvania County.
It's 1860 and we have a new president, President Abraham Lincoln. Unfortunately, this has been a disparaging thought for a lot of the people in the South who believe him to be an abolitionist, which he's really not yet. But they decide that they are going to lose out on getting any new states as slave states. Therefore, particularly in South Carolina, they decide they're going to secede. And in doing so, they take about 8 or so other states with them. Now, one mistake they really made was they captured the federal arsenals to get weapons. And this was an attack on the United States. So that is what started the war. So now we're sending troops down to South Carolina, and as they cross the Virginia border, Virginia secedes and takes North Carolina with her. So now there's several states that are seceding. So Lincoln calls up for troops from all the different states. The governors have to send their militias because there are not enough United States troops to fight a war.
Now, if I were to tell you that in 1860, the United States got itself involved in a civil war, the North against the South, pro-slavery against anti-slavery. The South had seceded from the Union. They had formed their own army. They had elected their own president. They had fired on the United States, committed treason against America. And for 2 years, President Abraham Lincoln and his white army had fought against these Southerners, trying to stop them from rebelling, trying to bring them back into the Union, and they were not successful at it. So Lincoln reached the point where he realized that he had to do something about slavery in order to end this war. Why was that? Because the South had figured out how to use slavery to help the Confederate war machine. How do they do that? For every soldier that Robert E. Lee and the Confederates have on the front line, there is 7 civilians backing them up. And who are those 7 civilians? Those 7 civilians are the slaves. And so Lincoln had realized by then that the slavery itself, the institution of slavery, enabled the Confederate Army to put more of its able-bodied white men on the front line to kill American soldiers, to kill people. And so he realized by then that he had to do something about slavery in order to save the Union. So he passes the Emancipation Proclamation, bring 200,000 African American soldiers into the Union Army, new soldiers, fresh bodies, people who are motivated because there's only one way out for them. They have to win or die because there's no going back to slavery. And so they get these motivated soldiers. They also disengage the black civilian population from working in these factories down in Richmond, where they're building ammunition, where they're growing the food, they're making the clothes that the Confederate soldiers wear. And so they found a way now with the Emancipation Proclamation to make this a new war, a war about the abolition of slavery. So if I were to tell you that Lincoln needed all of that in order to win this war, to save this Union, to keep America united under one flag, and yet they left all of this out of the history books, what would you think about that? What would you think about that? You would think, well, boy, that's a mighty big secret for somebody to keep for all these years. Well, we dug into the archives, found all these records. We found these battlefields where these soldiers fought. We found the names of each one of these individual soldiers, 209,145 African American soldiers and all their white allies and Hispanic allies. We put them on the wall of a monument here in D.C., in Washington, D.C., in the historic Shaw community. We put them out there on stainless steel with bronze statues in front of them that are made in granite walls. We took the toughest material known to man. Why did we do that? Because we intended for this to be permanent. If you go into the archives, into the libraries, and you find something that's been hidden that's this important, what do you do when you find it? You put it out in the public, so it can never be hidden again. And so we built a monument here in the nation's capital, and we spent the last 20 years really promoting this as a sight to see, as a place to visit, and we know now that the world is interested in this, and that's why we get so many visitors here at this monument every day and every year.
At the beginning of the Civil War, black men were not allowed to be soldiers in the Union Army. That will change in July of 1862 with the passing of the Second Confiscation and Militia Acts. That allowed black men to serve in any capacity that the Union commanders wanted.
Down here in Spotsylvania, they realized they're in the middle between Washington, D.C. and what will become the Confederacy capital of Richmond. And so this is going to be a hard-fought place, and it was.
In April of 1862, the Union Army is going to occupy Fredericksburg area. At that time, over 10,000 slaves will escape, and they will be with the Union Army in a servant capacity. And once the Union Army leaves Fredericksburg, they will go to the Washington, D.C. area.
Once the Emancipation was signed, Lincoln freed all the slaves in the South that was still fighting. Now, the 23rd is here in Spotsylvania with General Grant during the Wilderness Campaign, and they get caught up in the fight, and they're the first regiment to fight in directed combat against the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee. And of course, we all know now that the blacks went on to fight all the way through to Appomattox, and without them, the Union would not have won the war. So they fought for their own freedom and obtained it. Few people know that blacks have fought in every war this country has fought in since the beginning, including the Revolutionary War.